You know, when I was a kid, one of my favorite things was connecting the dots. This is a metaphor you've heard a lot about, but I have a sneaking suspicion that I may have to explain this to the video game generation, because I know these exist now, but they're not too common. There are these books, and each page had dots, and each dot was numbered. And you put your pencil on dot number 1, you drew a line to dot number 2, and then dot number 3, and so forth, until this seemingly random array of dots created a picture. And we've heard since 9/11 how if only we had connected the dots among the scattered bits of information that we had about most of the 19 hijackers, we might have been able to prevent the attacks. I think the same is true in understanding poverty. We need to connect the dots among scattered problems that poor families have and see their interactions in order to understand how poverty works. And you can't solve a problem until you understand it. So that's what I'd like to talk to you about this evening, if I may. Connecting the dots and seeing the interaction among the constellations of problems that people face. You know, the federal government defines poverty very simply. If you're a family of 4 this year and you earn $20,549, you are poor. If you earn $1 more, you are not. But the poor families I spent 5 or so years with, going back to time and again, understood very well that getting out of poverty was more complicated than showing a passport and crossing a frontier. Because poverty is not just income. Income is a still photograph of the present. Poverty is also debt. Debt is a moving picture of the past that's carried into the present and burdens the future. Debt is just as much a part of poverty as income. I knew a man in New Hampshire who was without work for quite some time and didn't go to the dentist. He had no medical care. Every time he had a toothache, he went to an emergency room. And you know that by law, hospitals are required to treat you, but they can also bill you. And so he ran up a bill of about $10,000, which he could not pay. So much that when he finally did get a decent job as a roofer, which placed him above the poverty line, he had such a bad credit rating, the phone company wouldn't even install a phone in his house. So poverty is not just income, it's also debt. Poverty is a sense of powerlessness. Some would say a learned helplessness that prevents people from being able to anticipate the long-range consequences of their actions, often because they see no connection between what they do today and that action's impact. They don't feel powerful. They don't feel able or capable of changing their situation. Poverty is powerlessness. Sometimes just a perceived powerlessness. But perceptions in this case become reality. Poverty is relative. A Vietnamese farmer who owns a couple of acres of rice paddy and a water buffalo to plow is not poor in Vietnam. But a Mexican farm worker who is paid by the bucket of cucumbers he harvests in eastern North Carolina and who lives in a cinder block barrack crammed into a tiny room with 5 other men is poor in America. Poverty is relative. It means standing at the edge of an affluent society whose affluence you contribute to, but which you cannot fully enjoy. So the working poor include the man who washes cars but doesn't own one. The assistant teacher in a daycare center I met in Akron who could not afford to put her own 2 children in the daycare center where she worked. The woman I came to know in Claremont, New Hampshire, who for a time filed canceled checks in the back room of a bank when she had in her own checking account a balance of $2.02. The working poor harvest sweet potatoes that we're all going to enjoy a few weeks from now on Thanksgiving. The working poor cut our Christmas trees. The fruits of their labor are in our lives every day, but we do not see them Not fully. Even when we see them stocking shelves at Walmart or checking us out in the supermarket, they are not full people to us. We do not see their poverty, which is hidden in plain sight, to borrow a phrase from Edgar Allan Poe. And I think the reason we do not see their poverty is because they have jobs, and they wear their jobs as a kind of camouflage to blend in with the society's expectations of how people are supposed to function and prosper. Because we have a very important myth in America, a very important dream, which says, if you work hard, you will prosper. Now, this is such an important myth that we tend to believe it. We tend to believe it. As Richard Wright said, and not Dartmouth's Richard Wright, but the other Richard Wright, he called this the truth of the power of the wish. The truth of the power of the wish. It's a very useful myth, as many myths in societies are. I wouldn't be dismissive about it, because it sets a very high standard for us. And the gap between that myth and the reality is a gap that we yearn or should yearn to close. So it sets an ideal, this American myth that if you work hard, anybody who works hard can prosper. The trouble is that there is another side to this myth, and that's the judgmental side. Because if it's true that everyone who works hard can prosper, then it must also be true that those who don't prosper are not working hard. And so this is a coin with two sides. The dream on the one side, the condemnation on the other. This is the American myth. Alongside this is what I think of as the anti-myth. The anti-myth in America is that all poverty is produced by the society's failures, by the failures of public education, private enterprise, government services, and so forth. And I found that as I thought about this, as I went out and spent time with families, that it was pretty hard, actually, to put any individual person in either one of those boxes. Either that the society was entirely responsible for that person's plight, or that the person herself was entirely responsible for her situation. It was a mixture. It was quite a complex mixture, actually, of bad choices and bad fortune, of roads not taken and roads cut off by chance or circumstance, mistakes, dropping out of school, having a child out of wedlock, doing drugs, getting in trouble with the law, not learning skills, not showing up to work on time or at all. And yet, many of these personal disabilities were the products of being badly parented, badly schooled, badly housed in neighborhoods where the horizons of possibility are so close at hand that they blind people even to their own imaginations of what might be possible for them. So the myth and the anti-myth coexist in these families. And of course, they describe the political discourse, if you want to call it that, or stalemate, when we think about poverty. Conservative Republicans tend to see the individual and the family as the source of the problems. Liberal Democrats tend to see the society as the source of the problems. And I would like to see the Liberal Democrats and the Conservative Republicans, each of whom has their own pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, sit down at the same table and put all those pieces out on the table and assemble them, and then they would have a full picture of the full range of the problems of poverty that families face. It's not a culture of poverty, as Oscar Lewis, the anthropologist, said in the 1950s, although his term has been taken and distorted, often by the right, as a way of condemning people who are poor to their own fate. I didn't find poverty to be a culture. I don't think it's a set of mores and rituals and values that's transmitted from generation to generation. Poverty looked more to me like an ecological system of interactions between individuals and families and their environments of schools, neighborhoods, the private sector, government services, and the like. And the question is to describe this ecology and think about how it might be changed. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the people I encountered who demonstrated the complex and sometimes counterintuitive chain reactions from problem to problem to problem. A boy with asthma came into the pediatrics department at the Boston Medical Center. He was having a lot of attacks that were forcing him to miss a lot of school and forcing his mother to miss a lot of work to bring him to the doctor. Research in the last 20 to 30 years has demonstrated that housing conditions can often exacerbate asthma. And the incidence of asthma among children in the United States has risen dramatically, especially among poor children. But when apartments contain dust mites, mold, dampness, roaches that shed their skin into a fine dust that's breathed in, it can cause asthma attacks. So the doctors who treated this boy realized that they could prescribe the steroid inhalers and so forth that are standard, and yet when he went back to his apartment, when they asked the mother about the conditions, they realized that he was going to be back in the clinic again the next week and the next week and the next week. So they sent a nurse to the apartment who looked at the heavy drapes and the wall-to-wall carpeting and realized that they were probably full of dust mites, which were very difficult to get rid of. And there was a leaky pipe that was creating dampness and mold. So she wrote a letter to the landlord asking him to take up the carpet. The mother took down the drapes. She could do that. Take up the carpet, fix the pipe. No reply. So the lawyer at the pediatrics department of the Boston Medical Center made 2 calls to the landlord, and miraculously, the carpet was taken up, the leak was fixed, and after some weeks, the boy recovered, got back to school regularly, the mother was back at work regularly, didn't lose her job. A lawyer at the pediatrics department. The pediatrics department at the Boston Medical Center now has 5 full-time lawyers who are paid by charitable donations because the pediatrician, Barry Zuckerman, who heads the department, understands that lawyers are as important as doctors in treating disease among the poor who live in terrible housing conditions. He's also got staff there who negotiate their ways through the labyrinth of welfare and food stamp and other benefits for which people are eligible but are not signed up. So trying to get them the assistance that the law permits them. Now, this interaction between housing and health can have some very serious consequences for people. And by the way, the Boston Medical Center, with a grant from the Kellogg Foundation, has started up a whole facilitating program to form medical legal partnerships all over the country. There are now about 75 such partnerships. Not all include full-time attorneys. Some of them use attorneys who do pro bono work without being paid and so forth. But it's a growing phenomenon, and one that Zuckerman thinks is important because he feels lawyers have more access to the political system than doctors do and might be able to actually make change in public policy. But the point here is to see the interactions. I got to know a single mother in New Hampshire who was working for the state of New Hampshire as an employee or I don't know what her title was, I can't remember, custodian or assistant in a group home for mentally ill adults run by the state. She was making $8.21 an hour. She had medical insurance. But with that low wage, she could not save anything. Every dime that came in went out. She had a son who had asthma. And because she had very little money, she had to move into an old drafty house, after which her son's asthma got worse. Twice he had to be rushed by ambulance to the hospital. And for reasons that she was never able to sort out, her insurance company paid for the emergency room, but not for the ambulance charges, which amounted to $240 one time, $250 the next. So she had to pay them, and she couldn't, not all at once. That debt went on her credit report. And when she tried to buy a mobile home to improve her housing, she couldn't get a loan. And when she had to replace her old car, which she needed to get to work, a reputable dealer ran a credit check and said, "I'm sorry, I can't sell you a car because I can't make you a loan." So she ended up at a sleazy used car lot that didn't do credit checks but charged her 15.75% for a car loan. That was when rates were a little higher. She paid it because she needed the car. And she told me about this the same day that I happened to get in the mail an unsolicited offer for a car loan at half that interest rate, which illustrates a very important point. When people borrow money, they're like corporations that borrow money. The higher their financial rating, the healthier they are financially, the lower interest they pay. So a corporation floats bonds that are rated AAA, they're going to be paying a lower interest than a lower rated company. The folks we're talking about here are not rated AAA. They pay higher fees on their credit cards, they pay higher fees on their mortgages if they can get them, on their car loans. They pay late fees, they pay check cashing fees, they pay all kinds of fees that those of us who are fortunate enough to have a decent balance in the bank never face. As one kid said to his mother when she was poring over her checkbook one day, "Gee, Mom, being poor is very expensive." One of the things I discovered in the course of spending time with these folks is that housing, which in the case of the woman I just mentioned, led to a health problem, which led to a higher car payment. Housing is more than a place to live. It's a key link in a chain reaction of events. And housing can contribute to malnutrition among children. Now, this happens in a very straightforward way, actually. All you have to do is kind of think about it for a minute. Rents have gone up very, very steeply in many parts of the country, to the point where a working family at low income, maybe who doesn't have any housing subsidies, isn't in public housing, doesn't have Section 8 vouchers which can be used to help pay privately owned housing, a family like that may be paying 50 to 70% of their income for rent. Now, rent's not optional. You have to pay that every month. You've got to make the car payment every month. We have a very poor public transportation system in the United States. People who work generally have to get there by automobile. So you've got to pay the rent, you've got to pay the car payment, you've got to pay the electric bill. Those can't be squeezed. What can be squeezed in the family budget? Food. And that's what people squeeze. Food stamps do not cover a full month's food, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3 if you can really work it well. And what's happening is, I spent some time in a couple of malnutrition clinics talking to parents who brought in their underweight children, is that they just don't have enough money for food very often. Now, there are a lot of reasons for malnutrition besides a lack of money, which we can go into later if you want to explore it after I finish, but money is certainly an important factor. And a study was done a couple of years ago of 12,000 low-income families in 6 states that found a high correlation between the lack of housing subsidies and underweight children. So here we have a situation where seemingly very unrelated, disparate problems, high housing costs and the lack of government subsidies, can contribute to a problem that, if it affects kids in the first 2 to 3 years of life, when brain development is at its most crucial, can have lifelong consequences and produce lifelong cognitive impairment. Because it's been shown that even if nutrition is restored in later years, the early deficit is not overcome. Now, at the head of one of the malnutrition clinics, pediatrician Debbie Frank said very simply, about school children who come to school hungry. She said, learning is a discretionary activity. It doesn't happen until you're well fed. I met teachers who teach in inner city schools who would take granola bars to class. And when they saw the vacant look of hunger in students' eyes, they'd toss them a granola bar. If kids don't have adequate health care, and the House failed today to override Bush's veto on the S-chip program. If they need eyeglasses, can't see the board. If they have a toothache, I mean, you've had toothaches, I'm sure a lot of us have too. You don't think about anything else. It's very hard to learn when you have health problems. If you miss a lot of school, you fall behind. When you fall behind, you don't understand a lot of what the teacher is saying. Debbie, who was a teacher, suggested that I ask students what percentage of the time do they not understand what's going on in class. And the answers were stunning, 20, 40, 50% of the time. So then I'd say, well, what do you do if you don't understand? And the kids would say things like, well, Miss Jones will explain it to us, but Mr. Bates, he's mean and he just tells us we should be paying attention. Now, I've never loved school, but I tell you, I can't imagine sitting in class all day, 5 days a week, not understanding half of what is going on in a classroom. And kids who are malnourished, who have cognitive impairment, are very often in exactly that kind of situation. Do they stay in school? Do they finish high school? Or do they drop out? Well, a lot of them drop out. So you see the interconnections here. It seems odd when you first think that poor housing conditions can contribute to malnutrition, can contribute to learning problems, can contribute to dropping out of high school. And what is the effect of dropping out of high school? Well, if morality isn't enough of an argument, consider the cost to society. A couple of researchers did some calculations in which they figured that a high school dropout earns about $260,000 less over a lifetime than a graduate and pays about $60,000 less in taxes. That the average 45-year-old high school dropout is in worse health than the average 65-year-old high school graduate. The high school dropouts have a much higher chance of getting in trouble with the law and going to prison. And so it seems pretty clear that the less we invest in children now, the more we will have to invest in prisons later. These are interconnected issues. Connect the dots. Now, there are a lot of what some people would call internal problems that many people in poverty have. One of them is a deep sense of incapacity, of incapability. I spent time one night with a group of recovering drug addicts who were living in Washington, D.C. in a halfway house. They had been through drug treatment, and their job now was to get jobs. They were supposed to be out there looking for work. And these men sat around a couple of times a week as a support group talking about their experience of looking for work. Now, these were tough guys. They'd survived the crack wars in D.C. Some of them had lived on the streets. A couple had been in prison. The last emotion that I would have imagined they're expressing to each other, much less to anyone else, was exactly the emotion they were feeling as they were looking for work. Fear. Fear was the word they used most often. They were afraid to apply for jobs. They were afraid of being asked about their police records. They were afraid of being rejected. And a couple even said they were afraid of being hired into jobs they did not think they could do. I spent some time at a couple of Los Angeles housing projects where there was a job placement program, and I asked the staff what the obstacles were to people getting work. All the staff members independently put fear near the top of the list. People in the housing projects wanted to work, but they were afraid to go outside into the larger working world, which they didn't feel they understood and didn't think they could survive very well in. They wanted jobs with the housing authority in the projects. That's where they felt most comfortable. Although these projects were centers of gang and drug activity where I was advised not to go interview after dark. That's where people felt most at home, most at ease, most comfortable, and that's where they wanted to work. I spent some time in a job training center where people coming in to the program, many of them had trouble even having a conversation. So defeated were they, having failed in school, in relationships, in job after job. They looked at the floor, mumbled, and the training program treated that problem along with the hard skills. And so one of the instructors was a retired Marine Corps sergeant. A lot of tough love. He'd get people to stand up in front of the group every morning and give a little talk extemporaneously. I can't hear you. Look at me. He'd structure the course, which was in office skills involving computer work, so that everyone had at least a small success every day. And it was remarkable to see what happened to folks. Little by little, step by step, their eyes came up off the floor, their voices gained clarity, and they ended up, most of them, getting fairly decent jobs, in fact, or jobs with promotional possibilities. One of the people I got to know there was a woman who said that I should call her Peaches in the book. She was homeless at the time, living in a shelter at night. She was coming to this job training program. She'd been terribly abused as a child in a foster family, called all kinds of horrible names, and told me she thought so little of herself that when she had to steal for food, she never stole anything good, like a steak. She didn't think she was entitled to that. She stole packages of bologna and so forth. In fact, it's odd that we call the programs for people in poverty entitlements, because I didn't find anybody at all who felt entitled to anything. People tend to blame themselves. They've internalized the larger society's views. They've internalized the American myth. If they don't succeed, it's their fault. One woman in Cleveland, when I asked her how she got to this point, she said, lazy, I'm lazy. I said, lazy, you get up at 3:30 or 4 o'clock every morning to go to work on an assembly line at a bakery doing a job I don't think I could do for half an hour. You work harder than I do. Why do you think of yourself as lazy? And she couldn't articulate it, except to point to a few mistakes she'd made along her way, mistakes whose consequences seemed to her to be irreversible because she felt powerless. Now, I talked to employers, and I heard from employers complaint after complaint about people getting hired and then not showing up to work, not calling in when they couldn't come, and that sort of thing. And I took this information to a woman in New Hampshire, Anne Brash, who was extremely perceptive on all of this because she had grown up in the middle class and fell into poverty after a divorce. And I said, Anne, I'm hearing this from employers. What do you say? She said, maybe people don't think they're important enough for anybody to care if they come to work. I took that back to a few of the employers, and it was like the old cartoons of light bulbs going on off over people's heads. Yeah, that made sense. The one young man in Cleveland, who's the third generation of a family that owns a manufacturing company, they make hydraulic and fuel hoses for industrial machinery, said, well, he said, this fits with what I think it was his grandfather said. He said, you know, when you take over, you're going to have to turn your collar around, be like a priest, and minister to your workers. So when somebody doesn't show up to work and doesn't call, he'll call them at home and say, how come you're not here? And if the guy says, well, my car broke down, he'll send someone to pick him up and bring him in, to get the idea across that he needs it. Otherwise, he's going to miss a production deadline. He's going to have to pull people off another job. This is rare in business. It's rare. But it understands something about people's sense of deep inadequacy. It's very hard to overcome. And one of the problems that I found, to my surprise, and I didn't expect it, and I didn't ever ask anybody about it, was childhood abuse. Most poor households in America are headed by single adults, and most of them are women. And most of the women I interviewed told me they had been sexually abused as children by their fathers, or their stepfathers, or their mother's boyfriends, or the older siblings in a foster family. I didn't ask this question. I would say, tell me about your childhood. And it would come out, sometimes in the first interview, sometimes later. It was very difficult for me at first to understand why they were telling this, talking about such an intimate trauma to a perfect stranger, And until I began to understand that it was probably because I was a stranger, that I didn't know their families, and that they felt that it was at the center of what had gone wrong with it for them. Many of them said they could not form lasting attachments with men. They didn't trust men, no surprise. That they felt extremely vulnerable and powerless when their mothers would not protect them, and so forth. Now, I would never argue that sexual abuse is more prevalent among lower socioeconomic families than among the affluent. I don't think we have good data on this. People are reluctant to report it. I have a feeling it cuts across class lines. I do know, though, that if you don't have the money to buy therapy and counseling and get professional help, you probably have less chance of recovering from this. Doesn't mean that all therapy is going to help and solve problems, and it doesn't mean that you can't recover without it. But when you feel completely isolated and alone and don't have the wherewithal, you certainly are at a disadvantage. And for many people, this is a trauma. And the reactions are post-traumatic stress syndrome very often. There can be an emotional cutoff, which is protective, but it's exactly the wrong kind of thing to be a good parent, which involves the need to be emotionally accessible and trusting. So these disabilities can carry over generation to generation very often with no way out because of a lack of wherewithal and knowledge that will afford treatment. You know, this is a remarkably greedy society that we live in. We're told all the time by our politicians, some of them at least, that we want the money we earn is ours, and we want to keep it in our own pockets and whatnot. We have ostentatious wealth. The disparities are dramatic. You know, in 2004, the Federal Reserve did a study, I think they do it every 3 years, that showed that the top 10% of the American households had a net worth that had grown and was averaging 3.1 million per household, the top 10%. But the bottom 25% net worth had declined to minus 1,400 on average. Means 1/4 of American households owed more than they owned. 1/4. This is an enormous disparity. And one that's exacerbated by the decline of labor unions. We have now, overall, about 12.5% of American workers are in unions, lowest since the Depression. Government, it's 35, 36%, but in the private sector, only 7.9% of American workers belong to unions, which means we almost don't have unions in the United States. There's a bill that's been in Congress for several sessions that would facilitate union organizing at the workplace. Some Northeastern Republicans favor it, but by and large, it's not the Republican majority for all those sessions certainly wasn't going to pass it, and I don't know what I think it's been reported out of committee in the House now. I'm not quite sure where it stands, but chances are Bush will veto it, although it seems to me that it's ideologically inconsistent, because if you believe in a free market, you really need to have a level playing field between buyer and seller. I mean, if I go into a Middle Eastern market and I want to buy a rug, and there are rug merchants, and we negotiate about the price, and I could walk away and he could say no. We're on an even footing. But in the labor market at low skilled levels in the United States, except in a booming economy, which we don't have, the seller of labor is at a disadvantage. And the buyer of labor really has much more power. So this is not a free market now. It's a rigged market, because workers cannot bargain collectively for their wages. So that's part of the issue. I was having dinner a year and a half ago with a guy I know in Birmingham, Alabama. He lives in a very posh suburb, and I was telling him about having visited some inner city schools where they didn't have enough textbooks for the kids. And as a math teacher in LA said to me, if you don't have a textbook for every student, you don't have a textbook for any students. You can't give them to some and not others, so teachers end up Xeroxing chapters. Some schools have limits on how many pages a week you can Xerox. Well, these teachers may have 135 kids, 5 sections of 25 kids each or whatever. And they spend their own money going to Kinko's and doing that kind of thing. And this guy was amazed. He said, my kids have 2 textbooks for each class, so they don't have to carry them back and forth between home and school. The disparities are enormous in this country. But the odd thing is that alongside the greed is a very powerful current of generosity in America. We have, as de Tocqueville noticed a long time ago, and is still the case, probably the most active philanthropy in the world of any country. I mean, those of you who pay full tuition at Dartmouth cover maybe 55% of the cost of educating. Full tuition, because of the endowment, generosity of alumni and so forth, grants and so on. Now, this place couldn't operate without philanthropy. Certainly not the way it does. So, I mean, look at the reaction after the tsunami, the outpouring of giving that came from the United States. Look at the reaction after Katrina, the donations, the people who put refugees from New Orleans up in their homes, in churches and so forth. There was enormous generosity on display. And I kept running into this all over the place. There's a Walmart in Claremont, whose manager said they were having a meeting of employees one day, and he announced that one of the employees, he didn't name who, was going to have a tough Christmas. And the workers put in $1 or $2 each until $300 or $400 had been collected. And one of the people who contributed was the worker who was being helped. And you could say, well, Walmart could do a lot more for its workers than collect their hard-earned money, but that displayed a tremendous spirit of giving among people who didn't really have a lot of cushion to give. Tom and Kara King, a couple who lived in Newport, New Hampshire, were remarkable people. I mean, Kara had cancer, and when they went to sit in the waiting room, they noticed that there were kids there, and there weren't any toys for the kids to play with. So Tom and Kara were very poor. They were out of work when I met them, both of them. But they got their kids, their 3 kids, to go through their toys and pick out toys they were willing to donate to the waiting room. And Tom, who's kind of a carpenter, made a toy box and everything, and they took it and they gave it and they put it in this waiting room. When Kara found out she had to have a bone marrow transplant, they took what little money they had and decided to treat themselves to a dinner out. And they went to a truck stop and took the kids, and they sat at a table talking, laughing. The 2 boys got into a contest to see who could eat more. And when it came time to pay the bill, the waitress said, "It's been taken care of." They said, "What are you talking about? It's been paid for." And they were a little put out, actually, because they didn't really like charity. And Kara especially hated to be pitied. She hated it. And all the way home in the car, she was stewing about this and getting angrier. And so she got home, she picked up the phone and called the diner and got the waitress and said, "Who paid our bill?" Waitress said, "Well, he's still here," and handed the phone to a guy who explained that he was a truck driver, just passing through, didn't get home to see his family much, and couldn't help overhearing snatches of their conversation. He said, "I counted. Your children told you they loved you 20 times. Kara broke down, stopped being mad, but I always thought of Kara as having an internal balance sheet. Every time anybody did something good for her, it went on the debit side. She had to do something good for somebody else." She died not too long after that, leaving Tom as a widower with 3 kids. So, generosity. We do have it here. The question is how to harness it. So I want to put a question to you that I've asked all over the country. Let me just preface this by just saying that the interaction between the private and the public sector is at the center of our ongoing political debate. It happens all the time. I mean, Bush has said he doesn't want to sign this big increase in the state children's health insurance program because he's afraid it's going to woo families away from private insurance when they can get government insurance. The Democrats say these folks can't afford the private insurance. So this is part of our discussion and debate. But let me ask you this. How many of you would be personally willing to pay higher income taxes to help address the problem of poverty? Let's see the hands. Well, this is an overwhelmingly large yes response. Of course, this is a biased sample. Instead of, well, I guess you're going to have time to watch the Cleveland-Boston game, actually, even after this. But you're making a sacrifice to come here. Listen. Now, how many of you who raised your hands have told elected officials that you were willing to pay higher taxes? Let's see how many of those there are. Very few. See, that's the gap, isn't it? That's the gap. The politicians don't think anybody wants to pay higher taxes. I had a conversation with John Edwards about this first time I met him, and I said, well, I've been getting this response all over the country. And he looked at me as if I were crazy, because he understood that raising taxes is the third rail of a political campaign. And it is. He's right. But I think that people are much more willing to do this than political leaders give us credit for. And you sit here with a very unusual opportunity to make this point to presidential candidates, all of whom come through here. And so when you go to these candidate forums, those of you who raised your hands, and that was almost all of you, put it on the agenda. Ask the question. Make the candidates talk about poverty, government's role in it, taxes, and all of these issues. Because unless you do, they're going to think nobody's interested. John Edwards is the only one who really consistently talks about this issue. Most of the others don't. And in the general election campaign, you won't see it mentioned. I guarantee poverty will not be talked about. I mean, assuming Edwards doesn't get the nomination, which it doesn't look as if he's going to. So you have a really unusual opportunity to put items on the agenda that you're concerned about but don't get talked about very much. And as you do, I hope you'll remember to connect the dots. Thank you very much.